Writing to the Christians in the 50s AD, Paul is addressing the fact that they are struggling. The Emperor Claudius has already sent Christians out of Rome. Society is constantly treating them with suspicion, and because they refuse to worship the emperor as divine, to sacrifice to idols, and to participate in public religious festivities, the Romans considered them to be atheists, so that when Rome suffered misfortune, the Christians were always the ones to blame because the misfortune was evidence of the upset of the gods for their atheism. And so the Christians were in a difficult spot because on a social level, they can't thrive in this kind of environment when they're always implicitly and then explicitly enemies of the state. And so Paul says to them in the second reading we heard today, whatever was written previously was written for our instruction, that by endurance and by the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. Hope. Hope is a virtue needed, I believe, in every age, especially our own. I think in our times, while we're not being kicked out by the emperor, most of us feel that the times we live in are very uncertain. There's this volatile economic instability that makes the marketplace unpredictable. There's ongoing rapid technological change that makes it almost impossible to position ourselves for a stable and flourishing future. And all of this is going on while there's mounting political tensions on a national and on a global level. There's also a widespread crisis of meaning, particularly among the youth, who suffer from a mindset of nihilism that believes that nothing really matters, that they don't matter. They are an accident of history, a blip in the channel of time, and one day they will be gone, and their life will be of no importance. We need hope, but in order for hope to be hope, it has to be anchored into something solid, something unchanging and dependable. And for Paul, that was the message of the scriptures. But why? What was it that Paul saw? Now, the scope of that question far exceeds this homily, right? This is a homily, this is not a college course. But one little shard of that appears in the first reading today. So I want to go through that reading a little bit more carefully to understand what it is that Paul is seeing, but really so that we can benefit with that same sight and find ourselves as Christians in today's time as a people of hope. So what does he see in the first reading from the prophet Isaiah? Well, to understand that, we have to back the clock all the way up, right? So 720 years before Christmas, before Jesus is even born, God's people, the Israelites, are facing their end. The threat of the empire of Assyria is looming over them, and with that, the destruction of their kingdom, which was established by David, the temple that David and his son Solomon built, and the covenant that they've enjoyed that was made through David himself. They faced as a people total annihilation, and those that were going to survive the ensuing calamity were going to be carted off into exile. Imagine their mindset at this time. You think people are anxious now? They didn't have SSRIs back then. However, worst of all, underneath this anguish is the pain of knowing that all of this is happening as a result of their own infidelity with God. That they violated the covenant so badly that now what is happening is simply the unrolling of the carpet we call consequences of their decisions. They wanted to separate themselves from God, and now they can enjoy life outside of God's protection. And yet it's precisely in this space where God is allowing them to experience the consequences of their actions that he offers them this message of hope. So he says, on that day, and that day is the day of redemption, on that day, a shoot shall sprout from the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a bud shall blossom. Jesse is David's father. So this is a reference to God's promise that the Davidic throne would have a king forever. And while the Israelites are watching the kingdom around them be totally destroyed, God is assuring them the fact that one day a king will in fact come from David's line and he will restore the throne. Now, who's that king? Jesus. You guys must have went to Catholic school. He's always the answer. That's right. It's Jesus. We just celebrated that about 2 weeks ago with the Feast of Christ the King. Now, we have to check out all the hallmarks, though. Isaiah describes this king. Like David, Isaiah says the Holy Spirit's going to rest upon this guy. Well, the Christmas season ends with a feast of the baptism of the Lord, where the Holy Spirit comes down upon him. This king is described as wise, as just, devoted to the Lord, which is reminiscent of David's son Solomon, who was all of these things, at least for the beginning of his reign. Well, Solomon was known for his parables. That's the source of his wisdom, and his parables are recorded in the book of Proverbs. What is Jesus known for in the Gospels? Parable after parable after parable. In Luke's Gospel, there's like around 24 different parables. He's proving himself to be the fulfillment of what Solomon was supposed to be. Isaiah says, he shall strike the ruthless with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. This language is judgment language. So John the Baptist gets all about it when he's talking to those Sadducees and those Pharisees. He says to them, you brood of vipers, this guy's going to come and he's going to chastise you with fire, with fire. Now, the rod of his mouth, we could even be more specific. That's the gospel. Because the gospel corrects error and it challenges wayward hearts. It convicts people. Simeon said to Mary as she's holding the infant Christ, he will be the cause of the rise and the fall of many. He is the determining factor of what happens in our life because of how we respond to him. The breath of his lips, he shall slay the wicked. This is an image of the Holy Spirit. We think of John's gospel after the resurrection. Jesus breathes the Holy Spirit onto the apostles and gives them the power to forgive sins. Which begs the question, what is the wickedness that's being slain? Well, it's sin in our own hearts, but it's also the demonic authority. And we see this actually featured most powerfully, not only in the proclamation of the gospel, where sin that originates in the human heart is cut down, as Paul will say, but actually in that font where we are baptized, where we are lowered as enemies of God because of original sin, under the authority of the devil, our father, and we are raised as sons where wickedness itself has been cut down. And then Isaiah goes on to say he's going to cause a new exodus where all nations are going to stream toward him, and he's going to establish a new Eden on this mountain of the Lord. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about the mountain of the Lord being the church. And so it's in the church that we see all nations streaming towards, and we discover the peace of Eden that was lost, a peace that is founded on reconciliation. Reconciliation among creation itself, so you see the lion laying with the lamb. Reconciliation between humanity, and then humanity's relationship with God, and the destruction of sin, because we have that image of the baby laying with the snakes in the adder's lair. Well, that should call to mind the curse of Genesis, where God puts enmity between the woman and her seed and the serpent and his. And yet now they're hanging out together, having baklava. And all of this is going to happen in the life of the church. So Jesus fulfills this by establishing the church in our midst. Like, are you guys taking notes on all this stuff? That's a lot, right? That is super specific. And because of that, Isaiah is either going to be totally right or everything they believe is nonsense. There's no middle ground on that. So what happens next? What do the Israelites do with that? Well, the line of David, They held to that promise. The community around them is dying. People are being carted off in exile. The fires are burning. The kingdom is collapsing. And the advent of the Messiah's coming begins. This is like the first advent. 2 centuries later, the prophet Daniel's in Babylon, and he says to God, when are you going to fulfill this promise? And who appears but the angel Gabriel? And he says to him in biblical language, 500 years. In 500 years, all of this is going to happen. So a few exiles go by, the rise and the fall of every kingdom that God said was going to come, and the time is getting closer and closer and closer. It gets so close, in fact, it's now time to act. And the family of David is handing on this message one generation after the next without any evidence of this being fulfilled. They keep telling their sons and their daughters the day is going to come when a bud shall blossom from the stump of Jesse. Now, the word bud in Hebrew is netzer. So the family of David, as the clock ticks close, they build a town called Netzareth. It's the town of the branch of the bud. What does that word make you think of? Nazareth, right? So once 500 years have passed, the tiny but remaining portion of David's family, they build this town and they await for the Netzer to appear until one day, who comes down from heaven? The angel Gabriel to a young virgin named Mary in the small town of only about 200 people or less called Nazareth, and the rest is history. That's amazing. That's amazing. We who now benefit from all of human science could calculate the odds of that actually playing out, and I'll tell you right now, spoiler alert, 0. Right? The chance of this happening by accident, 0%. And because of that, that is a source of hope that Paul was able to give to the Christians in Rome who were suffering, to show them the model of David's family as one of endurance. That no matter what was happening around them, how bad things got, how quiet God seemed, they held to the promise that the king was going to come, that God would not abandon him. And they were right. And they were right. So for us today, these details should astound us. And in the face of uncertainty, we can have hope because God proves himself the Lord of history. When wickedness rises to power, we have hope because God conquers evil. When we suffer the pains of life, we have hope because we know that suffering comes to an end. Jesus' kingdom is eternal, as is his justice, which requires that he bless those who remain faithful to him. And when the cause of the evil is our own sinfulness, we have hope because Jesus in his church puts an end to sin. So for you, faithful people of God who have come here this morning in this holy season of Advent, raise your heads high because that hope is going to dawn upon us in 3 more weeks.